Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you for everyone who's here. I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your interest in learning about how these pieces work. So as Dane referenced, we have an overall training of what to expect and what we're going to do, but then we wanted to have issue specific training. So you feel a little bit like you understand what we're asking for and why we're going to the Hill and why the things that we're asking for in particular matter and how they would impact research funding, the ability for us to have coverage for certain individuals for Medicare and also drug parity, just to really give you a little bit more information so you feel more comfortable in terms of all the talking points we give you, so they don't just look like a bunch of information that you don't understand or don't have background on. So trying to give you a little bit of depth in terms of your understanding of it. And of course, always ask questions. Feel free to ask questions. And when you go to the Hill, there will be the staffers will ask more questions, and it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I'm an advocate and this is my story. And for those details, we'll get back to you. We'll have MetaViver or folks from Dane's group get back to you and to fill in information. So always know that as advocates, we're really glad you're here. Your stories are really impactful. They really make a difference. And the main thing you are bringing to this conversation when you go to the Hill and you talk to lawmakers and their staff is your story, your experience, your reason for being there and why it matters to you as an individual, as well as a constituent, because you're going to offices where you are a voter in those offices. So you're going to talk to the senators from your state. You're going to talk to the lawmakers who represent your district where you live. So we want to give you this information so you have it, so you have a little bit more understanding of it, but it is by no means the thing that you are responsible for memorizing or having backwards and forwards or being able to dig deep into and have your own research done. That's not what this is for. It's to give you an overview so that way you can feel good about talking about it. But like I said, if you have any in-depth questions from staffers, feel free to refer them to us. If you have questions for us now, feel free to ask them and we'll do our best to answer them right now. But if not, we can always dig and find the answers. So thank you again for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to Dane to cover appropriations of federal funding and why is that relevant to metastatic breast cancer and what we're going to ask for on the Hill.
Thank you, Alpha, and thank you, Sonia. And of course, if anyone has any questions about the presentation tonight, this builds on a presentation from last week about advocacy, why we do it, and how it works. Why we talk to elected House representatives and senators, what that means for us in terms of coverage, access, out-of-pocket costs. And the presentation tonight is specifically about research funding. And of course, in a nutshell, the federal government has a lot more money and resources for research than nonprofits can ever have. So MetaViver is very good about raising funds for researchers. And that is great for getting young investigators interested in the field. It's great for getting people ready to compete for those grants. But what the National Institutes of Health and the government tends to offer is multi-year, multi-million-dollar, sometimes clinical trials, sometimes treatment development work, but very significant pot of resources. So anything that MetaViver is doing helps prime the pump. And then these other advocacy activities and the resources that the government provides really allow the researchers to move things forward. And of course, in a nutshell, the more money there is for medical research, the more treatments get developed and they get developed faster, and that's just an oversimplification, but that's how it works. So this is being done in the context of the Stage 4 Stampede and what's going to be happening in October. But of course, we always say advocacy is not just for one day a year. So this is advocacy that can happen all year long. The federal funding process that we're talking about tonight got started back in the end of February and won't be completed probably until December. So the Stage 4 Stampede is very good to check in on those priorities, to talk to members about what we need in terms of funding. But there are other good opportunities throughout the year too. August visits with groundswell at the start of the year, and anytime you can connect with your member of Congress or their staff. And as always, nothing we're talking about is partisan or political. Democrat, Republican, House, Senate, doesn't matter. What we're trying to overcome is a lack of awareness and information. Members that don't know about metastatic cancer, that don't know about metastatic cancer research funding, and don't know about metastatic breast cancer. The best thing you can do with your story is dispel myths and misperceptions they might have. Oh, aren't the treatments really good now? Doesn't everybody get diagnosed early on? Doesn't the Inflation Reduction Act or Obamacare cover all of your costs? You know what your lived experience has been. So you can tell these offices what the gaps are and challenges and what that means for you personally. In this case, though, we're going to be talking about research specifically. And what that means is improvements in patient care and improvements in treatments that are developed and therapies that are available. So this is a conversation that you almost have exclusively with your senators and representatives on Capitol Hill. So in the Constitution, Congress has the power of the purse, the House specifically, but the Senate too is deciding how much money, where it goes, and what it's for. So that's why we're talking to these members and putting a strong case forward for metastatic cancer spending. And when I say that, I mean, these are members that are deciding everything. They're deciding how much money goes to the FBI, how much money goes to the Department of Agriculture, how much money goes to the Department of Energy, and how much money goes to medical research. So there are different types of federal funding. There's mandatory spending, and then there's discretionary spending. Research funding for things like metastatic cancer fall in the discretionary pot. So it's at the discretion of Congress. How much in a given year? Is that amount going to go up or down? You know, is the high tide going to float all boats? Or is it staying exactly the same, and inflation has now meant that each dollar is a little less valuable? So mandatory spending is things like your Social Security benefits or Medicare. Congress does not decide how much money goes to this on an annual basis. This is already determined. So your Social Security money will always be there. It is not being decided upon by Congress. Same thing with Medicare, you know, funding for the military, other types of programs. Discretionary spending is the money for other stuff, medical research, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Public Health, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the parts that aren't related to user fees from industry. That's all discretionary. And it's what Congress decides on every year, how much, where it goes, and what is prioritized. And this is a member-driven process. And the members are driven by their constituents. So there's an old saying, when it comes to them deciding about funding, you can be at the table or you can be on the menu. So you have a chance to get more funding, but if you're not advocating, if you're not telling them why this matters, there's always a chance that the money that's already available could be diminished or reduced on an annual basis. But another way to think about it is the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which is a phrase I'm sure we're all familiar with. People making a case for themselves, saying why this matters, is what drives this forward on an annual basis and influences that discretionary process. There are a couple of key committees that work on this in the House and Senate. Once again, every member of Congress can make an impact on every issue. What we're trying to have is a critical mass of support. Dozens of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that are all in lockstep saying, we need to end metastatic breast cancer and we need to fund more research. Same thing in the House. Like, we have strong individual champions like Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, Chris Smith from Connecticut, and I'm sure many others, but they can't do it alone. It's a process that involves multiple senators and multiple representatives and majority support. So the more people that are on board with the message, the easier it is for our champions to make a difference. But when it comes to this specific process, things start with the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee decides how much money we're dealing with in a given year and gives out allocations. And then the House and Senate have appropriations committees. There are 12 subcommittees. They deal with all the individual spending bills. So the agriculture FDA bill, the military and the VA bill, and the labor, health and human services and education bill, which includes the bulk of research spending. So these folks are deciding as they write these bills with their colleagues, how much, where it's going, and what instructions are coming along with it. Along with the money, what are the agencies being told to do? So they can provide more money to the National Cancer Institute, for example, but then they can also provide instructions saying, we want you to do more in liver cancer, breast cancer, or metastatic cancer. It matters a great deal. So where are we at today? We were working on this last year. Last year, Congress was dealing with something called the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is in place for last year and this year. Last year, it said they have to use the same amount of money they used previously. This year, they said they can do that plus 1%. So there's our budget caps. There are limitations on that overall amount of money that's available. They can still squeeze the balloon and adjust it to any specific accounts they want, but the overall pie, for lack of a better expression, is the same size, even though the slices could always be cut differently. So for FY24, with our advocacy, the National Cancer Institute, which is at the National Institutes of Health, and of course is tasked with the cancer portfolio specifically, received a $120 million increase. NIH overall received a $300 million increase. So all biomedical research through NIH got a $300 million increase. $120 million of that was specifically for cancer in the National Cancer Institute. So even in years when there's a struggle to have additional money, we've still managed to secure good outcomes for our specific priorities. There's also research programs at the Defense Department and at the Veterans Administration. I want to be clear about this. Though many of these research programs did not exist before 6 years ago, when metastatic advocates really began going to Capitol Hill in earnest and saying, cancer research is great, but there's not as many resources as there should be for metastatic cancer specifically. We have to do better. So the NIH has been funding more, but the Defense Department also started funding metastatic cancer research for the first time. And the VA also started funding metastatic cancer research for the first time. These programs only exist because of you and your advocacy and your work with senators and representatives. So it may feel like a drop in the bucket, but it tends to add up pretty quickly. So then what are we talking about for FY25 for NIH and the National Cancer Institute and these other programs? We are asking them to give NIH about a $2.5 billion increase to get up to $51.3 billion with a B annually, and to give the Cancer Institute a proportional increase there. So about 8% increase for the National Cancer Institute. There's also a new initiative called the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or ARPA-H. ARPA-H is funded at $1.5 billion right now, but it is meant to be more focused on specific questions. So not general research where scientists are submitting applications and the best projects are being funded and the best cancer projects are being funded. ARPA-H is going to approach issues like the Defense Department does and saying, we need better diagnostic tools in this area, or we need to develop a cure in this area. And then they laser focus on that specific outcome. They are largely set up in tandem with the Cancer Moonshot to focus on cancer issues, but not exclusively. Another thing that's important when I mention those instructions and work that gets done with the money is we've been trying for some time with the scientific community to modernize something called the Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results, or SEER registry. And what the SEER registry is the data that gets tracked about cancer in America. It's a combination of the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The bill authorizing the SEER registry was signed into law by Richard Nixon. So as you might expect, how this country tracks cancer is very much stuck in the 1970s. It needs to be modernized. And now, as a result of all of your outreach, it is being modernized. There's a need to capture metastatic disease better. There's a need to have better reporting, and there's a need to understand cancer stages better for the metastatic community. NIH and CDC are now working to do this, and Congress is providing them with money and instructions where available. The last thing is to make sure that metastatic cancers continue to be part of DoD and VA research. And this happens because senators and representatives write into the spending bills that this is what that money is for. They've been doing it for 5 years now. They're going to continue to do it this year, but they only do it because they know constituents who are affected, who've come to them through events like Groundswell and the Stampede and asked for them to do these things, to make sure there is this research funding available. So as I mentioned, in addition to providing the money for NIH, $51.3 billion, money for the National Cancer Institute, 8% increase, more money for ARPA-H, more money for DoD, more money for VA. They also include these committee recommendations. Listed on the screen is committee recommendations from last year on metastatic breast cancer. The one about the SEER registry is actually what Congress just put out today. The Senate marked up their labor HHS and defense bills today, and they included this language on the SEER registry again. And they did it because so many of those senators, including Tina Smith from Minnesota, the senators from Connecticut that were at the Stampede last year, know folks that are impacted and want to make a difference. So they're leading this effort, but they're doing this for those folks they represent who have told them why this matters. So what's the state of play between the House and Senate right now? This is how we decide at the end of the year which set of numbers we're supportive of. The House is trying to cut top line numbers, so less money overall for everything. They view the budget control that we're under as the high water mark and are trying to go below that. It's a negotiating tactic. It's unlikely to be the final mark, but that's where the House is at. The House has also included a number of what's called poison pill policy riders. This includes completely reorganizing the NIH into new institutes and centers. So that makes the bills in the House unlikely to move forward. And the other thing to note is the House likes to invest a lot in defense. So they have more money for the VA and more money for the DoD, but they haven't increased the funding for the breast cancer program at DoD, for example. So, the House allocations are not great, even though they've helped with some of our programs. The Senate, on the other hand, was TBD. That's my dog barking, if you can hear it. But the Senate was TBD, but as I mentioned, they just did their bill earlier today. They haven't put all the information out, but the Senate effort is very bipartisan and is trying as much as they can to increase funding for all of these programs, both defense and non-defense. There is a really solid increase for NIH in there, about $2 billion, I believe. So right in line with what we're asking for. They're working to hit that 1% increase level for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And then they're also going to advance what are called supplemental spending bills. So they can provide emergency spending that goes outside the spending limits and allows them to give, in this case, an extra $13 billion to non-defense programs and $21 billion to defense. So we will know exactly what we're asking for in October for the Stampede. But the Senate, even though the House is okay, the Senate and what they're doing looks to be even better. So we want to thank everybody for their support, but we're probably going to tell them, let's adopt the Senate allocations at the end of the day. And that will be close to exactly what we're asking for, that proportional increase for NCI, that additional money for the NIH, and then the language on SEER, for example, and the money for the DoD and VA programs. So as I mentioned, this is a little bit of a briefer presentation. We do want to open it up to questions, but before we get there, there are going to be 2 more content-specific webinars next week. One on the Metastatic Breast Cancer Access to Care Act and the need to get fast-track disability benefits and fast-track Medicare benefits. That's going to be on the 6th at 6 p.m. Eastern again. Then we're going to do another brief overview of an issue, in this case, the Cancer Drug Parity Act, why that matters, why it matters if you have access to both oral and infused chemotherapy and not being charged different prices and things like that. That's going to be on the 8th at noon Eastern time. There will also be a virtual kickoff meeting closer to the Stampede itself for everyone who's registered. Very important that folks RSVP and also register through the online information for the Stampede with what Sonia and Alpha have provided. We need an accurate head count. And if you want to do congressional visits, we need you registered as early as possible so we can schedule those with your offices. But we're going to stop the recording here, and then we are going to be able to answer any questions.